Welcome back to the Leadership Lab. I'm Evan McGugan, former naval officer with over a decade of experience in special operations. I hold an MBA and a master's in psychology and leadership from Penn State. And now I advise executives, elite coaches, athletes, tradesmen, and working professionals in leadership development. So let's start with the hard truth. Every TED Talk, HR seminar, best-selling leadership book all love to repeat a same tired line. And that is great leaders know when to ask for help. And it sounds nice, but here's the problem. If you're a man, asking for help comes at a price. And according to a 2015 study, male leaders who seek help aren't rewarded for their humility or collaboration as much as people think they are. They're actually penalized, not just by their boards or bosses, but also by the very teams that they're trying to lead. Meanwhile, female leaders, they're not only spared the penalty, sometimes they're even praised for it. So the question isn't, should leaders ask for help? The real question today is, why do we punish men for doing the very thing we claim to value in leaders? So let's break the illusion and let's look at what the science actually says and what it means for how we talk about leadership. First, let's get a few things straight. Asking for help isn't just some fluffy leadership cliche. It's critical for better decisions, faster learning, more creativity, and it enhances the organizational success. Harvard Business Review, McKinsey, you name it, they all agree that leaders who ask for help from their teams actually do run more effective companies. So, why aren't we seeing more of it, especially from men? Well, despite what some organizational psychologists think, what HR experts say, or counselors are going to tell you, the social costs for male leaders are very real while remaining minimal for women. Now, the research team behind this study went looking for why male leaders get penalized for asking for help. And there's two main theories behind this study. The first is role incongruity theory, RCT for short. And this theory says that leadership is seen as an archetypally masculine phenomenon. It's agentic, it's assertive, it's confident, independent, and decisive. And so men are often considered the prototypical leaders just by showing up, acting with agency, and being assertive. But when they ask for help, it clashes with that masculine prototype that so many of us hold for our male leaders. The second theory is status incongruity hypothesis, SHI for short. And this theory says that men lose status when they show weakness. And so help seeking is perceived as prototypically weak, so men get penalized. And it's about violating the social pecking order since leading is presumed to be from a position of authority where you presumably have some sort of abundant resources, which could be cognitive or physical, depending on the domain, and therefore you have influence. So, does the penalty happen because men aren't typical leaders when they ask for help, or is it because we see them as weak? And so, to figure this out, the researchers from this article ran three separate studies. The first study, they put business students through a real leadership challenge across multiple continents. Think mountain climbing, mountaineering, team survival, situations where these students encountered serious adversity in some pretty desolate places like Antarctica, Wyoming, Ecuador, Patagonia, and even Mount Kilimanjaro. Each day, someone different was randomly assigned as a leader, and afterwards, everyone rated how often their leader asked for help and how competent they seemed afterwards. Now, the second two studies, the participants read detailed stories about a fictional company leader, either male or female, and who sometimes asked for help and sometimes not. And what they measured in this second series of studies was was the typical leader seen as prototypical when they asked for help? Were they seen as weak? And most importantly, did people see them as competent after asking for help? Now, here's where it gets a little uncomfortable. The first finding was that male leaders who ask for help are, in fact, seen as less competent as leaders. And so, in every study that these authors did, the men who asked for help got dinged on their perceived leadership competence. And the more they asked for help, the worse they looked. And it didn't matter if they led with a task oriented or masculine style of leadership or a relationship oriented, which is typically considered a more feminine style of leadership. Now, the second finding was that the female leaders who asked for help suffered no penalty in their perceived leadership competence. When women asked for help, there was no drop in their perceived competence. And in some cases, it was even slightly positive. Now, the third study, or the third finding in the studies, was that it's not necessarily about weakness. The theory that held up the most was role congruity theory. And so, based on their findings, the authors contend that the penalty for men wasn't because they seemed weak, it was because the help seeking was seen as atypical for male leaders. So, it doesn't fit what people hold as a stereotype for what a male leader should be. So, in other words, the men in leadership positions, if you asked for help, while it has a ton of utility when it comes to solving problems, you do risk people seeing you as less of a leader, particularly if you do it repeatedly. Now, women in leadership positions, ask for help all you want. There's no penalty, and you might even get a boost from how you're being perceived as a leader. So, all the advice about humility, vulnerability, collaboration, I'd advise taking it with a grain of salt, especially if you're a man. It seems to apply differently depending on your gender and perhaps even the context. So it's probably best used as a surgical tool for male leaders rather than a blunt object. So let's talk real world. If you're a male CEO, a manager, a team leader, you're kind of in a lose lose situation when it comes to asking for help. If you stay stoic, you don't ask for help, you risk missing out on key info and burning out from decision fatigue from the decisions that rest entirely on your shoulders, as opposed to collaborating and getting more information and having other people help you with your decisions. And then if you ask for help, you risk your team doubting your own competence. But for women, the advice of lean in, ask question, get support, it works. So for men, it's be the rock, know the answer. And this creates a double standard that is not talked about. It is unfair, but it's also bad for business if you don't help. So it's a tightrope, lots of tension that male leaders have to walk. And here's the kicker. A lot of organizations and teams will say they want collaborative leaders, but based on basic evolutionary psychology and culture, the evaluation systems penalize men who actually try it. Now, what about leadership style or industry? So, if you're a man who leads in a task focused way, there's no difference in whether or not you ask for help. The penalty still hits you. But if you work in a female dominated field like retail or nursing or the beauty industry, there's still no difference. Same penalty for male leaders. This bias seems to be baked into how people perceive the different genders when it comes to leadership. So we love to talk about the new leadership models and breaking the old molds and overcoming biases. But it seems that when a man steps outside of I've got all the answers persona, people will still see him as less of a leader when he asks for help. So if you're a man, collaboration is a double-edged sword. One, it's very necessary, but two, comes at a cost. So, used judiciously, it has immense benefits to decision making, ownership, team performance. But when used belligerently, it impacts how your team perceives you in terms of your competence and ultimately risking the influence you hold over your team. So, the key takeaway here is never ask for help, or it is not never ask for help. But as a male leader, you need to know the landscape that you're operating in. So leaders who never ask for help obviously are going to miss out on new ideas, creative solutions, and they're going to build worse teams. But as a man in a leadership role, you need to be aware that the bias is real and it exists. And the research here doesn't say that the bias is fair or justified, only that it is. So what can you do about it? Well, here's where we can get a bit more practical. One is you can frame your help seeking behaviors as a strength, and you can obscure how much you are seeking help. So don't ask for help in a way that makes you look like you're lost. Instead, frame it as something that leverages your team's expertise to get even better results. So make it clear that you know your stuff, but ask it in a way that makes it seem or is a way to optimize decision making as opposed to delegating your decision making to someone else. Second is be strategic about when you ask for help. So it's probably better to ask for help on things that are external factors rather than internal factors. For example, here's a market shift we need to adapt to, and I want to know what you think, rather than here's a market shift and I'm not sure what to do about it. So show decisiveness in your leadership while still cultivating a genuine curiosity in what your team has to say. Third is building a culture where help seeking and collaboration is normal for everyone. So, as a leader, reward others for speaking up and collaborating, and then make it clear that getting help is a sign of a smart team rather than a weak leader. This is something that I think the special operations community does really well because because their leadership ascension pipeline is very, very thorough. So by the time you get selected for a leadership position, there is a presumed competence that you arrive with. Now, you still have to prove that competence day in and day out, but you're starting at a much higher baseline. So there is much more room to work with in terms of asking for help. And there's an expectation that the problems that that community solves are going to be complex and not everyone is going to know all the answers, so that there is an expectation in the culture of that community that leaders are going to ask for help, and it is good that they do so rather than trying to solve everything themselves. Leaders that do that in that community and in every other industry are going to fail if they try to do it on their own. So that is something that organizations can use to their benefit, is making sure that their leadership ascension pipelines are thorough enough to where the people that step into leadership roles are presumed to arrive there with a fair degree of competence that people can assume that they have. Next is at least being aware of, if not calling out, the double standard. So if you're in a position of influence, you can you can decide how much you want to do this, but talk openly about this bias. Use the research, make it a conversation rather than a unsaid secret. So if you're a leader, you can ask yourself, is your team or your workplace really as open and collaborative as you think? Or are there hidden penalties, particularly for men, when it comes to seeking help? So, one thing you can do is you can share this video with your team, and then you can challenge your team or your organization to be a bit more candid and a bit more honest about the leadership double standards that we have to navigate as both men and women, because we each have our own. So, why does this research matter? Well, this isn't just an academic debate. It impacts how we evaluate leaders. It shapes who gets promoted. It shapes who gets listened to. And ultimately, it shapes how successful the organization and teams that we are a part of become. And so, if we keep penalizing the genders for the biases that we sometimes inherently hold for doing things that actually make the team better and smarter, then we're going to be stuck with suboptimal leadership. So I would argue that it's time to rethink, what we reward in leadership and leaders, regardless of the gender that they are. So bottom line, men are penalized for asking for help when it comes to leadership. Women aren't. That's just the way it is. The penalty comes from being seen as a non-typical leader rather than being seen as weak. So if you want more effective leadership, you have to confront these hidden biases head on or find a way to intelligently navigate them to get what you want out of your teams. If you got value from this, like, subscribe, share the video, and let's help change the leadership game.